Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Our webinar today is Strategies to Increase Supply Chain Resilience. I'm your session moderator, Jara Lee, Program Director here at ICOR, and our presenter today is ICOR President Linda Nelson. And now I'd like to turn the session over to Linda.
Thank you, Jara. We're going to be talking today about how to increase the resilience of our supply chain. We have a couple of logistics things as far as our webinar objectives. We're going to be looking at supply chain risk, security, and continuity. We're also going to look at how we can understand the nodes and links in the supply chain. Also evaluate the vulnerabilities and capabilities of the supply chain. And take a little bit of a look at how you might implement Agile supply chain management. The recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webinar page in a day or two. So if you want to watch it again, or you've missed it today, you wouldn't be here to hear this message, but it will be there. If you have questions, use the questions button. Jara will be monitoring that, and she'll either answer them to you during the webinar, or we can also answer them after the webinar if we don't have time. I'd like to start off with a poll and just get an idea of your level of knowledge regarding the supply chain and risk to the supply chain specifically. So you have just really three choices. I have a high degree of knowledge, a moderate degree, and I'm here to learn. Teach me.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close the poll and share out the results.
So it looks like we have quite a few people that have a moderate knowledge, which is really great. Especially during this pandemic time, it's going to be very important for you to have a decent amount of knowledge about supply chain. And the rest of you are here to learn, which is a great thing. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about the definitions. There's a ton of definitions out there. So we have shared with you two of the ones that I think are I guess I want to say the most common. This first one is from the World Economic Forum, and it was put out in 2013. It's the ability of the system to return to its original state or stronger after a major disruption. It's very much risk-based. In addition, I kind of like the one that ISO, the International Standards Organization, has put out, in that it's much broader, and it's not just about the risk side of things. And so what they have done is say it's the ability of the supply chain to absorb and adapt in a changing environment. So instead of it being, during a disruption or anything like that, it's really much more about managing change. And so I think this makes it more relevant to all of us today, that when we look at what does change look like? And I'm going to actually challenge you to start thinking about change as being a risk. And change is happening so fast that if we have this mindset that we're managing risk throughout the organization in all facets, that it'll be part of how you operate. And so therefore, what ISO has done in their definition here is, you could say it's the ability of an individual to absorb and adapt in a changing environment, the ability of an organization or a community, and you can really input anything here, and I just inserted supply chain for the purpose of this presentation. We talk about the fact that there are several different disciplines that support a more resilient supply chain. And so the first one that you're probably the most familiar with is risk management. And you can use the ISO 31000 standard as a way to measure risk in your supply chain. And they really look at the risk in 5 buckets: demand risk, supply risk, environment risk, process risk, and network and control risk. So here, supply risk is actually one of the categories there. But you can use that risk management methodology for any aspect of risk. The second one is supply chain continuity. And ISO 22318 is what they call a technical specification that looks specifically at like the business continuity aspects of supply chain. And so they look at identification of the criticality of each of your products, whether you're multi-source or single source, what's the preparedness level, the business continuity preparedness level of each of your suppliers, and then like what priority does your organization have in the supplier's list of critical customers. So in other words, are you their most important customer or not a very important customer? And then thirdly, we have ISO 28001. And by the way, this is being rewritten. It's pretty dated right now, but it is going to be republished in the next year or so. And this talks about supply chain security, so looking at the actual transportation aspects as well as the technology aspects. So whether you're looking at cargo, facility, information, or human resources, the management of those aspects as they specifically regard to security. But I want you to remember that these are, while they're separate standards, there is definite overlap between each one of these. So when we're looking at the resilience aspects, we're really looking at the risk, the continuity, and the security between that. And you should really, as an organization, be looking at all of those and implementing those as a system. I wanted to start off with just some real basics. So, you know, as somebody, in order to have a supply chain, somebody has to buy it, somebody has to make it. You have to be able to move it from one place to another. You need to store it, and of course, you also need to deliver it. So those are really the high-level aspects of a supply chain. I want to move to a little bit more detail. This is a real simple graphic on how you might look at your supply chain and map it out. And we're going to talk about mapping your supply chain in several aspects. But to start with, there's going to be what we're calling links and nodes. So here, your organization is in the middle, and here you've got 3 suppliers, and these would be your tier 1 suppliers. So that's why they have a number 1 on them. So you're depending on these tier 1 suppliers for your most important things. And so then the links are how that, you know, your transportation links, how you get them. So how is your product transported from the supplier to you? And this is oftentimes as far as many organizations go. And this is where we're suggesting that you need to go one step further and look at, all right, here you've got one of your tier 1 suppliers, and they actually are getting supplies from 2 other suppliers. And then if you look to the right, you've got those are really emerging market suppliers. So what kinds of risks do you have with that emerging market aspect? And then a third one of your critical suppliers is a sole or single source. You can only get it from one place. And then you also, you know, this third one down here, the fourth one, you've got is really actually a good one because you've got local suppliers with some redundancy. So they actually have, while they're depending on a tier 2, they've also got 2 suppliers in their tier 3 piece. But here is where things get really tricky. It's important that you also understand if you've got risks within your supply chain because you've got 2 of your suppliers relying on the same supplier. And this is more common than you think. There's lots and lots of case studies. There was actually a story being told. I was at a conference in Asia a few years ago, and the speaker was giving an example of a real weakness in their supply chain, and he went and gave the names of not only the company that was selling the product, but he also gave the names of the 2 companies that were across the street from each other, literally, and all the risks that those 2 organizations faced. And he didn't really know his audience because both of those companies were sitting in his audience. And so you have to be careful what you also say publicly. But it really is true that if you take a really close look at your supply chain, what you often find is sort of those interdependencies between your suppliers as well. So we know that all supply chains face risk, and that the more complex and global your supply chain, the greater your exposure is going to be. a really great reference that you might want to take a look at. It comes out of the Deutsche Post, and they produce a report annually through DHL, and it's called Insight on Risk and Resilience, and they have a supply chain report that's very good. So take a look at that if you can. You can just literally Google this, and they'll give you can see reports going back several years. But one of the problems or one of the challenges that we're facing today is that the modern economy runs on this interconnected global supply chain, and the more distance you have and the more complexity you start getting new types of risk. So their 2020 report came out, and what they were looking at is what they were predicting at the end of 2019, what the risks might be in 2020. So this is really actually quite interesting. So one of the things that they're saying is that the risk you take, so whether your risk appetite or the risk that you're willing to accept, might actually cost you more than you want to pay. So when they did a survey of some of these companies, they found that 69% of them do not have full visibility into their supply chains. And that's probably because 63% of them don't use any technology to analyze, track, or monitor their supply chain performance. They also say that when you're looking at the board members, they felt that reputational risk was a place where they were most vulnerable as it pertained to their supply chain, but only 39% had a plan. And not surprisingly, 99% of the companies had experienced a supply chain disruption over the last 5 years. So then they went into the specific risks as to what they thought they were most likely to experience. And the number one came up with cybersecurity. So ironically, when you start adding technology into your supply chain, which I don't know how else you would do it, you are now introducing the risk of cybersecurity where people can hack in to your technology systems. Also, there's a lot of shifting in trade policies, and this is impacting the global cargo flows. We're also seeing a lot of economic sanctions on the rise. We're seeing more and more social equality protesting, and this is impacting that critical transport infrastructure. We're seeing breaks in the borders between countries, where we're having trouble getting product back and forth. Of course, the climate activism is also having an impact on your supply chain. You might not think so, but these are some of the things that are happening. There's also new environmental regulations which are impacting the supply chain and transportation industry. Also, when you start having new or alternate trade routes, this not only provides you with some opportunities, but also some threats. They're also seeing some real problems with narcotics cartels targeting container shipping lines. And of course, ironically, I don't want to say ironically, but this is the year for our Black Swan event with our pandemic. They always say, these are something you need to consider, but it is here. And we need to be considering it now if you haven't looked at it before. If it hasn't hit you in the face, you need to start thinking about it. Cranfield University also has published a lot of good work on supply chain risk, and they've divided it into 5 categories. The first one is demand risk. So in other words, whatever product you have, there's a risk to its demand, as well as, maybe losing major accounts or having some volatility, or your customer base is all in one place. Looking at that supply risk, or kind of like that continuity aspect, which is being dependent on key suppliers. Maybe there's been a consolidation in your markets, and looking at your lead time challenges. And then the environmental risks, things like natural disasters, terrorism, regulatory, taxes, strikes. We have process risk, which is looking at your manufacturing yield, looking at your setup times and your processes, being reliant on certain equipment. Maybe you have bottlenecks with capacity and maybe you outsource some of those things. And then the 5th risk that they put for supply chain is that network and control risk. That idea of poor visibility, the rules can sometimes distort the demand aspects. And this idea of not having enough collaborative planning and forecasting. But I want to just say that I think what we're all seeing today is that all of this, the pandemic risk, is impacting all 5 of these. So this Black Swan event, as a lot of people like to call it, is impacting every one of these 5 sources of risk, and it really is looking at supply chain risk as a worst case scenario. So I want to look a little bit closer at what are we seeing today and what's been in the news. So what's happening because of COVID? We already know that it's profoundly disrupted supply chains across the globe. And I can give a really simple example of in the United States, everybody is, one of the stores that's getting the best, they're doing one of the better businesses are those stores that sell products to help you with your home and construction types materials. And there's such a lack of resources that, and a delay in getting those resources to you, that I've literally been driving 2 or 3 hours to a store to pick up a piece, some kind of product that they're now saying will take 3 or 4 weeks to deliver, and that they're out of in any stores that are closer to me. So trying to do a home construction project sounds really simple, and if our just supply chains are being disrupted that simply, just for the the regular person, when we look at what's happening in companies, it's much larger impact. And some of the things that's having an impact on that is the actual manufacturing facilities. This idea of, is it safe to bring your manufacturing staff back into your factories? How do you make sure that they're safe? How do you manage the risk of people getting sick? How do you manage even the reputational risk of somebody suing you because they went to work and got sick? So that's a big question, and having to reset up your factory in order to make sure it's safe for people. And then you're looking at, what about your suppliers? Are your suppliers still shipping? Are they still in business? Are our customers still buying? I was talking to someone yesterday, and they were saying, and they're in the technology field, which at first got a big bump, but because of changes in how companies are operating, they've lost 40% of their revenue in the past 3 months, just because the customers aren't buying because they're doing business differently than they were before. And then the last aspect of this is the distribution aspect. One of the things that was happening in the U.S. was we had the food manufacturing plants, and specifically the meat and dairy industries, weren't able to manufacture at their same rates. And so they were literally throwing away really good milk and really good meat because there was no way to distribute them. So it wasn't about getting them to people. It wasn't about being able to produce it. It was about the fact that the distribution chain was broken. So these are some headlines that we're seeing. Your supply chain is being ripped open by the business closures. The Atlantic is another magazine that's saying, the modern supply chain is snapping. How we've built it has exposed really the fragility of your just-in-time inventory. The coronavirus from Harvard Business Review is becoming a wake-up call for the supply chain. That procurement is really struggling to keep up with this. Like I mentioned with the meat supply, the coronavirus has broken the food supply. It is getting better, but there are real challenges happening. On the technology side, companies like Samsung, they were having some supply chain challenges before the coronavirus. That only gets worse. So if your organization was struggling on the supply chain before, they're struggling even more now. Most recently, they're saying that from the supply and demand chain executive, that 75% of the companies are seeing disruptions due to their supply chain. But one of the things that's just come out this week from Fortune magazine is that the coronavirus should inspire businesses to start preparing their supply chains for the future. And so now you're seeing really worst case scenarios. So what can you be doing now to strengthen your supply chain? And looking at what are some of the beneficial aspects. I'm not a supply chain expert, but there's a whole pile of information from this article here on Logistics Viewpoints. And they're looking at what they're doing a study is on SKUs and how many SKUs they carry, which is, I believe, the amount of product that they carry. And so the COVID is actually helping organizations to take another look at that, to see if there's a way they can reduce the amount of product they're carrying. Another aspect of this is tied to choices. So, now if you want to go to some of the stores, you just buy whatever chips are available. You buy whatever brand of toilet paper you can get. I think some of the toilet paper crush is over. But what they're saying, at least here in the U.S., this was on MSN Money and looking at the American consumer specifically, is that companies are looking at what they're producing and they're limiting or reducing the amount of variety of what they're producing, and maybe they're down to producing 3 types of toilet paper or 4 types of toilet paper instead of 16. Or in this case, the IGA stores normally carried about 40 varieties of toilet paper, and they're reducing that now to 4. Even things like Harley Davidson for motorcycles are reducing the number of models because their manufacturing plants can't operate at full capacity, and so therefore, what can they do to still produce motorcycles but maybe not have as many choices or options? Same things at restaurants. I think a lot of us are seeing that when the restaurants have been closed, they reduced, if they were staying open for delivery, they were reducing the menu items, and what they're saying now is that maybe they'll just stay with reduced menu items, that might actually save them money in the long run. Some other things that we need to think about in the news is what's happening from country to country. So the U.S. has placed export restrictions on medical goods and supplies, which you would think every country would be doing. China has tightened its import restrictions on meat, dairy, and food products because they're trying to make sure things aren't contaminated. Some of the delays we're seeing are due to government-mandated shutdowns or because of, like we've mentioned, reductions in the workforce. Factories have been repurposed, so maybe the auto industry isn't producing as many cars, but instead they're producing personal protective equipment or sanitizers. And we've got this fluctuating consumer demand as well, and this is impacting a lot of companies, like we said, with their what they're able to sell, because the consumer is now working differently, and therefore that means that they're buying differently. So given all of this, we have our next poll, and really give us a measure of to what extent has your supply chain been impacted so far in 2020. So have you been severely impacted, moderately impacted? Have you had some impact or no impact at all?
Okay, I'll go ahead and close it.
So it's interesting, 39% of you, so just over a third, have been either severely or moderately impacted. And it's so surprising to me that 15% have had no impact at all. And maybe if I'd asked the question if I was speaking as an organization, to whether you personally have seen any impacts. But I think it also depends on where you live and what kinds of things that your organization produces. And hopefully some of you have been actually getting a positive impact. So, Jer, if you could hide the poll results. So we know that supply chain risk has major unintended consequence, and that two of the reasons for that is we've moved to this idea of globalization of our supply chain, as well as the lean production. And I'm sure this picture is something that you've seen before. It's this, how many countries does it take to make a coat? So to make a jacket for the UK market, Hong Kong producer, and this is somebody called Lian Feng, I don't know if this is kind of an older picture, but they ordered materials from factories in 5 countries and had them delivered to Thailand, where the jacket was stitched together. And then they used a network of websites, and they stay in touch with their worldwide suppliers, and they can compress the time it takes to get their items into the store. So China is the world's largest producer of cotton, and they made the liner. Thailand is the leading exporter of imitation fur, so they ringed the hood. Taiwan specializes in making material for the outdoor clothing, so they produced the shell and the fleece. Japan is the globe's biggest producer in stainless steel for zippers, so they produced the teeth in the zipper. And Germany, which gave the world a snap fastener in the 1880s, they sent the snaps. So here you've got 5 countries where the UK market gets their coats from via the Hong Kong garment producer. So you can see during a pandemic that the travel just to make that one coat and the logistics and distribution between all of that, how having, if you're just missing the fur in one area or you're missing the zipper, you're not going to be able to produce that coat. So what I want to look at next are some of the business trends that have supplied or that have really changed what we're looking at with supply chain risks. The first thing that we're going to keep mentioning is this idea of lack of transparency. A lot of companies don't know the routes and transport modes that their suppliers use. They don't know where their products are along the routes, and they're not aware of where their suppliers get their own components and materials. And when they take a look at this, managers are often surprised on how many parts rely on the same few suppliers upstream. So some of the trends that have made supply chains more efficient has also brought with them an increased risk of production. So the first one of that is the outsourcing and getting this from other, when you outsource, it can help you to be more efficient and be able to oftentimes sell something at less cost. But this means you're generally at a higher risk of disruption, as well as you might have an increase in quality-related risks that because you don't have control over the end product manufacturer. Also looking at specialization, where companies are starting to increasingly focus on certain tasks where they have a competitive advantage. Sometimes this means that you've got increased outsourcing of other tasks, and this can then, in addition, increase the exposure to particular disruptive events. As I mentioned earlier, and some of the things that you're going to hear a little bit repeated, which is a good thing because it makes me feel confident that different sources of knowledge are providing some of the same information. But the more you digitize, the more vulnerable you are to a supplier to cyber threats. But you're not going to have an idea of where your supply chain is without digitizing. So it's that, catch-22. You need to do that, but you also need to protect it. When you have increasingly homogeneous strategies and business models, that means that you're going to, an event that happens in a given sector is going to impact everyone. And so you may have trouble finding alternate sources in that event of a disruption. So if you get all of your product from a particular region of the world, and that region has some kind of a natural disaster, for example, that means everyone's going to be impacted. So you have to think about that as well. And then the intensity of your competition. Obviously, this generally increases the urge to prioritize cost minimization. And so this makes, what happens is then when you have a lot of competition is the cost is driven down and your resilience is become weaker. And there's really that clear balance or trade-off because resilience costs money. So whenever you reduce costs on things, it usually has an impact to your level of resilience, which is tied to that. You have an increased risk. You have an increased risk of your continuity being disrupted and your security as well. Another trend is this emphasis to build lean supply chains. We're looking at, the short product cycles. You've got this idea that you're trying to conserve working capital. And so companies are really have very little inventory. The days of warehousing are really, I don't want to say over, but warehousing is not something that a lot of companies are doing, which means you have then limited flexibility because you've got a consolidated vendor base. And a lot of times you're reliant on that single thread or a supply chain segment. On the opposite side of that is providing more flexibility. You can focus on being more agile. You can focus on, customer satisfaction versus productivity and cost. And I think we'd all love to be able to do that, but it's not always practical. So I'm trying to balance this idea of it's really lean on the one side and agile on the other side, and where can you be in that continuum in order to do the best business that you can and minimize your risk. One of the there's a really great article that just came out. I think it was early this week. Today's Wednesday, so maybe it came out either Friday or Monday. So on McKinsey, if you take a look at their is your supply chain risk blind or risk resilient? This is looking at, they've identified specific supply chain vulnerabilities. So they're looking at planning and supplier networks, transportation and logistics systems, looking at the financial resiliency of their suppliers, looking at the complexity of the product, and then looking at organizational maturity of the company itself. Then they move to, what kinds of, I don't even know how to say that word, cyclicality, we'll just go for that English word, that you have a high level of cycles, that you might also need long lead times for things, that you have to have certain level of inventory to maintain, and then looking at the approach for the product development as well. So there was too much in this article to share a lot of it during this webinar, but I would encourage, I have a couple of other slides that we're going to be looking at that will talk some more about this as well. This is one of the ways that they are taking a look at doing a vulnerability assessment. So here the blue is supposed to be the industry, kind of like the benchmark in the industry, and then the black is the actual organization. So here they're looking, you see the comparisons down the left that I just mentioned, and then under the financial resiliency scores, they're saying that the company, has a lower score than average for their leverage ratio. They have a lower score than average for cash ratio. Their operating margin is lower, and so is their variation in their operating margin. So this just gives you an example, and there's a lot of detail behind this, but just to give you an idea of some of the work that you could be doing to do some assessments on the vulnerability within your supply chain when you're looking at your individual suppliers, because we know that more than 80% of the companies are concerned about their supply chain resilience, and they really should be. So when we're looking at how do you manage the risks of lean against agility, so I want to look at your supply characteristics versus your demand characteristics across the bottom. So on the supply characteristics, you're going to see, the short lead time versus the long lead time. And on the demand characteristics, you're going to be predictable demand versus unpredictable demand. And when you look at short lead time and predictability, so you've got a predictable demand and a short lead time where you can really do continuous replenishment. When you have a long lead time and predictability, this is where the lean really makes sense. And then you can move to, when you have unpredictable demand and a short lead time, that's where you might implement some of your agile supply chain management. And then finally, when you have unpredictable and long lead time, this is where you might move to. This will be configured when we have the orders for it. So here is where looking at your supply chain, you really need to be looking at each aspect of it and deciding which aspects to be lean, which aspects to be agile, and which things that you're going to be doing continuously and which things that you might postpone. Goldman talks about this concept of agility all the way back in the 90s, and he really looks at it as being this idea of readiness to change, and that an agile strategy is really more responsive in a volatile marketplace, and where the strategy is totally demand-driven. And then also looking at balancing consumer buying patterns, because they're changing at a very rapid pace, and they do impact the supply chain management or the management of your supply chain. And then when you're looking at agile supply chains, it's really going to be tied to the agility of those consumer demands. So looking at the places where you can use agile and where you should use lean. So of course, I'm sure most of you have heard about, project management's agile methodology, and so the suggestion is that maybe you build a more agile team by using a Scrum approach, by looking at supplier output and your end customer need. You also might look at how you actually manage your teams and looking at how you reward people. So maybe you start rewarding people for efficiency and start tolerating a little bit of failure, where you can encourage staff and suppliers to learn from their mistakes. This is one of the main things about organizational resilience, is allowing people to make mistakes, and then how do you learn from that, and focusing on partnerships where you can go to get your answers. Also looking at your contracts, and this is where procurement becomes very important. Looking at, if you're trying to be flexible, you need to have redundancy. So here goes to your continuity aspects as well. What are your relationships with a range of suppliers? Trying to make sure that you've got multi-source as much as possible, where you've got buyback contracts or zero volume contracts for some of those suppliers in your lower tiers. And of course, we're talking about being smart, getting technology into the picture to help you, using AI and blockchain and all of those things to help you with that, and looking at the fulfillment aspects. This is what they're calling an Agile supply chain framework, and this comes from supply chain or conspect.com, which is they have a lot of work on supply chain management. And so they look at kind of putting lean and agile together in some aspects, but looking at this idea of vertical or virtual integration, so that you're sharing information about your demand, you've got collaborative planning, you've got end-to-end visibility, and then looking at your what's market sensitive, so getting point-of-sale feedback where you can capture emerging trends, and that you have an ability to listen to your consumers as well. So this means you have to be much more transparent and open and looking at communicating and sharing information. Also looking at co-managing inventory. This is something that's becoming more and more prevalent today. And maybe you have some synchronous supplies and more collaboration with your product design. And then moving to more network-based, where you can leverage your partners' capabilities. You can focus on your core competencies and act more as a network orchestrator versus doing everything in-house, which ties back, to being more decentralized as much as you can. So here is where the structure of your organization does impact agility. We've talked about this in probably every webinar, and everything that ICOR offers is this idea of being resilient or increasing your resilience means you have to build in agility wherever you can. And as part of that, you need to reduce centralization. And so agility works much better in more flatter structures versus the hierarchical. The more complex your organization is, the more hierarchical it is. So when you're looking at your external connections and you're looking at your supply chain, start thinking about how it's networked together and how you can utilize that to be flatter, at least in your supply chain aspects. You should also implement more of a multi-divisional structure where you can concentrate on the product, service, and geographical area, and then allow those local units to adapt to their local needs. And lastly, encourage empowerment. This means you have less formal rules, but you've also got positive factors to help you with that agile structure. The DHL Insight on Risk and Resilience is providing us with some examples about how you might increase the resilience of your supply chain. So we've been talking about having a really transparent view of what your supply chain looks like, and that's really going to be a lot of the focus here. So you need to have a holistic view. What are your strategies from corporate? What is it that they're trying to target with procurement and risk management? And making sure that procurement and risk management are talking to each other. If I even ask that question right now, how often does procurement and risk management or procurement and business continuity management, how much are they talking to each other? The question might be, when we review our strategies at the end of each year. That's sometimes the most common answer. So here we're suggesting that you design your supply chain with an explicit risk management focus, which means bringing in those people in your organization that manage risk, that they become part of the purchasing process. We also talked about using IT tools to get a very holistic view, again, on your supply chain management, or I'm sorry, on your the risk analysis side of that, as well as the monitoring, so you know where your suppliers are, you know where your product is, that you can actually see where, if it's stuck somewhere, and what's causing it to be stuck. So the companies, you know, if you're using any of those major distributors, there should be a process. I mean, if you order something from FedEx, you can kind of see where it's at, and you can see the track that it's taking. So you should have that same visibility, but more when it's your own product and in part of your own distribution chain. So if there's a problem, this gives you the opportunity to react rapidly in case there's something that happens as part of that process. And here, where we've got countries closing and you know, shipping areas shut down in a lot of places, or only operating at partial fulfillment areas, we really need to look at where can we reroute if we need to. And this brings us really to this idea of the focus on transparency. You need to understand what are your critical exposures in order to design adequate responses. And I hope what you business continuity people are seeing here is that business continuity plays a big role in the supply chain. And if you're not actively involved in the supply chain aspect, you really should be, because you're looking at exposures. And your knowledge of risk is going to be very, very important. So if you have risk people at your organization, you should be tied in with them and working very closely, because this transparency is going to allow you to have the information you need to react quickly. It's also going to help you to be aware of your vulnerabilities so that you can focus on reducing the vulnerability of the most important parts of your supply chain. And then you can concentrate on those products where the supply chain disruption would have the biggest impact. So I want to give you a couple of examples of how you might map out your supply chain. So you've got layers. The layers to the left are your suppliers. The layers to the right are your distributors and who you're selling your product to, or your customers. So in the middle, you have layer 0, which is your organization. The organization itself, for whatever product it is reliant on 3 suppliers. 2 of them are critical, suppliers 1 and 3, and the second supplier 2 is a tier 2 supplier. The supplier 1, who's critical to you, is reliant on suppliers 4 and 5. The supplier 2, that's part of tier 2, is relying on suppliers 4, 6, and 7. So here's where you can start seeing now you've got interdependencies with your suppliers themselves. And then supplier 3, supplier 7 actually provides supplies to your supplier 2, as well as provides supplies to supplier 3, as well as supplier 8. So here you can see really simply where the interdependencies are. Next, we're going to take a look at your distributors. So here you're using distributor 1, and they're providing product to customers 1 and 2. Your organization itself is providing a product to customer 2. So now you've got a duplication of sources there. So customer 2 is being very well taken care of because they can get product both directly from you and through your distributor. The customer 3 is fully reliant on you. They only get their product from you. And customer 4 is reliant on distributor 2 solely. So here's just one way that you can draw a picture, if you might, a very simple one, as to what your customer and supply chain might look like. I mentioned that this McKinsey & Company article on supply chain also had some other examples. So this is an example of how you can look at your sub-tiers, where you can identify some bottlenecks and also look at different risk factors. We weren't looking at risk factors at all. We were just mapping the supply chain in the first example. So here they're giving a cell phone example. So they've got the camera part, they've got the mechanical and electromechanical elements, and then they've got their integrated circuit content. And they've divided that out then into the parts that make up those aspects on a very high level. And then they've looked at how to quantify their risk factors. So whether it's, the product technology, the transport aspects, the supplier landscape, or the relevance to safety. So one of the things that while you're mapping this out is to then add into your risk factors and what do those mean. This helps you to gain a deeper understanding of the risks that are part of that. So we just gave you a couple of examples of how you might conduct a high-level risk assessment. There's a lot more detail that we could go into. We don't have time to do that in a webinar on how to do a supply chain risk assessment, but this is giving you some thoughts as to where you might go with that and who you might ask in your organization to ask those questions about what are we doing about this? What's the difficulty of detecting the risk up front before it happens? I can tell you that you're probably all saying, we tried to get our company to look at worst case scenario in these black swan events like pandemics, and they said they were willing to accept the risk and deal with it when it happens. That's what we've seen. That's the language that we're hearing from all over the world, and it's here. So, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So you need to, when you're looking at your risks, looking at that lead time available between detection and the impact, the actual cost of recovering from an incident. In this case, no one has any idea what the cost of this pandemic is going to be. Even looking at legal aspects is going to be huge. And then what kind of investment do you need to put those mitigation strategies in place? This requires you to take a network-centric perspective. Simple supply chains can often switch to an alternate source, but most supply chains aren't simple, as you've seen in some of the examples. Also, when you've got emerging market locations, you might not have as many locations. So consider how disruptions of those small and inexpensive parts can be critical to the overall product, because you can't fully understand without considering that network that they affect. So as part of that, you really need to make business continuity the foundation of your supply chain, managing your supply chain risk. So make sure that you are extending your business continuity strategies outside the wall of the organization. This is something that organizations that are certified to ISO 22301 still are not, part of their continual improvement, I should say, should be that they're including more and more of their suppliers, especially their critical suppliers. However, we're seeing that they're still just looking inside their own walls a lot of times. So you need to be looking outside of your own walls. You need to expect key suppliers to have their own business continuity in place, and you should be conducting regular checks to make sure that they are, because successful risk management programs are based on strong business continuity programs. This means you need to have data. And we have done webinars in the past talking about how important data is to a business continuity program and to managing risk. So you need to have processes that systematically collect and analyze your supply chain risk data. You should use multiple data sources, not from external data providers, public sources, customers, and suppliers, and then integrate this into your everyday operations management. Because organizations with a clearer view of a disruptive incident can respond more effectively to them. We talked about collaboration, even just between procurement and risk, and procurement and business continuity, and risk and business continuity, much less between all aspects of your supply chain. So if you have a supply chain disruption that's specific to your supply chain and not your larger organization, you might create a war room. In this case, we're doing everything virtually, and we all know how to do that now. You might look at how you can create alignment between your different supply chain partners, how can ensure that you've got internal alignment. I hear so often from business continuity people that they had all of their supply chain, they managed to get rid of all their sole source and single source suppliers, they'd multi-thinged, and then all of a sudden top management comes out and reorganized everything and got rid of things to save money. And now they're back to having the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities to that single and sole source environment again. So here is where this internal alignment is really, really important, and the importance of sharing the information so that when your management is looking at making changes, they understand the risks of doing so. And this is how you build in resilience. You need to not just be looking at your response aspect, but understand that when something happens, your response is dependent upon what plans you've had in place and what you've mitigated prior to some sort of an incident. And in this aspect, I wasn't really happy with how DHL wrote this, because it was much more about responding to an incident, where if you're building in resilience, you are strengthening your organization's capabilities so that you're much less vulnerable. But looking, how can you implement strategies for dual sourcing of your critical components? How can you engineer flexible product designs that will permit component substitution? For example, this is something that you often hear about in business continuity as well, is how can you put together partnerships with maybe even other organizations that produce something that's common to what you're doing? How can you share when one of you has some sort of an incident? When you've got in your product manufacturing, how you might change how you produce that product for different end users. This is kind of about that agile manufacturing aspect. And then looking at your transportation modes. So looking at what are our alternate routes that we can take when we need to, and having that already set up ahead of time as a backup plan. All of this is dependent on having the right culture. We always talk about resilience and tied to leadership and culture, because it has to come from the top. It is as much about culture as it is about process. I was talking to someone yesterday about a simple IT update, and because their process was so complicated, it was taking something that should have taken like 30 seconds to fix. It was taking days, because they had so many processes that they had to follow in order to make a change. But when you have the right culture, employees are committed, and they're recognized for focusing on risk reduction alongside their cost, quality, and delivery targets. So we're often only measured by the three, the cost, the quality, and delivery targets. We also need to have risk reduction targets. And so if you're responsible for any of those things, those are things that it would be helpful to reward people for that and recognize people for that, because leadership does drive commitment, and your staff should be rewarded for measures that prevent a disruption and not just for fixing things that have already occurred, which is what we're all doing right now. This is another really interesting article specifically to COVID-19 that was put out by eastwestbank.com. And one of the things they say is to take the time right now, while we're going through this, to reevaluate your contracts. Review in detail the terms and conditions with all your buyers and suppliers, and very firmly understand your legal position. This is huge, because a lot of times we're not looking at that, and because of this COVID-19, it's changing some of the legal positions. Determine the necessity of the supplier. Look at your relationships with your different suppliers. One of the things they're suggesting is, if you're dependent on a supplier and they're struggling, it might be an opportunity for your company to buy that supplier out and manage that risk by making them part of your own organization. You see that more and more, that organizations that have vulnerabilities are having to financially manage those by purchasing them and to reducing their vulnerabilities that way. We've talked about this idea of the diversification of your suppliers. You really, if all possible, should not be overly reliant on just one company or just one region of the world. So when you're diversifying your suppliers, you need to be looking at not just the product, but the region where it's produced. And of course, keep open lines of communication. You need to be communicating with your importers, your exporters, your suppliers, and manufacturers. The better relationship you have with them, the better it's going to be. And you want to be on their top of mind as well, to make sure that you're getting what you need from them when you need it. Because there is risk in return. There is an ROI for doing this, because an investment in more resilient supply chains doesn't just reduce the impact of disruptive incidents. It also helps you to boost your overall business performance. So I want to take a second here and do our last poll. And we had to combine these 10 recommendations because they don't, the GoToWebinar only allows us to have 5 choices. So look at which of the 10 recommendations for increasing resilience that you think makes the most sense for your organization. And you can choose all that apply for this.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close it.
This is really interesting. Everybody's, besides the business continuity one, which may be because you've got business continuity people here on the call, they have already done that, but everything else is about even score. I thought mapping the supply chain and customer chain would be the easiest one to implement. So I was expecting that to have the highest score, but that's really, really interesting. If you have any insight, you can use the questions button if you want to share, or in the survey that comes out after the presentation, to share any ideas that you might have. I would love to be able to share that through our LinkedIn, any insights that you have about how you're managing during this current COVID time, and specifically how you're managing the supply chain risks and things that you're experiencing. So please feel free to share that. You can put it, like I said, in the questions pane, and Jerry, you can go ahead and close the poll, as well as just send us an email or put it in the post webinar survey. This is part of what we're trying to do to share information, is to get information out to people however we can. So just to conclude, the management of supply chain risk, security, and continuity each contribute to building a more resilient supply chain. Ironically, one of the things I did a similar presentation to this one about 2 years ago, and supply chain security was the top risk factor at that time, and now it's about distribution in the manufacturing side. So risks to your supply chain are going to change, and the focus on how you can make it more resilient is going to move between that continuity aspects, which is kind of the pre-planning and the planning that you're doing ahead of time, and your security and your risk sides are going to change over time. And so it's really important that you look at all three of those. We know that supply chain risk, or supply chain resilience, is increased when there's an intentional effort to understand your nodes and your links, looking at that transparency aspect. And then when your organization uses that network approach to try to reduce silos both within and outside the organization, it helps you to have an increased visibility and helps you to be more agile to respond to risk and those potential interruptions of the supply chain. And of course, we know that implementing agile supply chain management is a key factor in building a more resilient supply chain. The question is, how agile can you afford to be in the market that you're in? And that's something I think we need to have an understanding of, is that being more resilient is going to cost you money on the front end, just like being prepared and managing risk costs money. But it should save you money over the long term. We always, of course, want to share that we have education in this area, and it is part of our Certified Organizational Resilience education and credentialing program that you can learn more about. And we also have upcoming webinars. So in August, we're going to be moving completely to a different thought, which is looking at how to do a facility operations assessment of your data center. Then we're going to be looking specifically in September about how to make your performance management more agile. And it's not just talking about individual performance management, but also about managing the performance of your organization. In October, we're going to be looking at crisis management, specifically what's lessons learned that we've had so far from managing the COVID-19 crisis. And then in November, we will be looking at the ICOR's Organizational Resilience Capability Assessment and how that works. I would like to say, are there any questions, Jared, that need to be shared at this time, or would you like me, we have like 30 seconds left, if you'd like me to just answer those afterwards.
Really, it was just questions about accessing the recording of the webinar and certification for attending.
Okay. Yeah, you will get your, I keep forgetting to say, you will get a certificate of attendance as long as you stay down for 35 minutes, and those go out in the next day or two. And of course, you can access the webinar recording starting again in the next day or two as soon as we get the recording up there, and then it'll be available for 30 days, and after that it is available on demand for all of our members. And if you'd like to learn more about joining, please check our website under membership. Thank you very much for attending. Good luck as you continue to work under the COVID-19 conditions.